Hello and welcome to a tutorial on events and listeners in LSPS forms. In this tutorial, we will first talk about the concepts of events and listeners in LSPS forms. Then we will go through an example form using different types of form components and listeners. Let's try first to get the big picture here. Business processes serve to automate procedures whenever possible. However, they still need to interact with human users to get new input and have existing data updated. In LSPS, such interactions take place via to-dos and documents. The content and layout of a to-do or document is defined by a UI form. You can watch the screencast called Simple Form in to-do and document, which is dealing with the concepts of to-dos and documents and their content. A UI form is represented by a tree of form components with exactly one root component. The root component will be typically a container component, since container components can hold multiple child components. On runtime, the LSPS components translate into a tree of Vaadin components. Every LSPS component translates into its Vaadin counterpart component. Sometimes, a single LSPS component translates into multiple Vaadin components. For example, if you use the LSPS repeater component, it can create multiple instances of its child component. Every instance is then represented by its own Vaadin component. When the user performs an action on a form component on runtime, so typically from a process application, the component fires an event. For example, if you click a button, the underlying button component produces an event called action event. Note the type of event depends on the action and on the type of the component. If you click into a chart, the chart produces a chart click event. If you drag and drop an event in a calendar, the calendar produces a calendar schedule event. If an event should cause something to happen, there must be a listener for that event on the particular component. The listener must be of the same type as the event. So if the listener is present on the component and is of the correct type, it catches the event. The event is then processed as defined by the listener. The listener can request refresh of form components, validation of data, persisting of data, submitting the to-do or document, and so on. Note that the listener cannot catch an event that occurs on another component. The exception here are application event listeners, since application events are broadcasted to all components of the form. We will get back to these in the next screencast, which will focus on form reuse. Let's now create a form with a few layout components, some input and output components, and define some listeners to demonstrate the concepts. I have here a GO-BPMN project called Event Handling with the stock check module. The module contains a data model similar to the one I used in the previous screencast. The author and the book records with one-to-many multiplicity. Note that the book record differs from the one in the previous tutorial. I have introduced the in-stock field. I have here also a query that returns all books ordered according to their title in ascending order. Here you can see that the database is already populated with some data based on the data model. Let's create a form that will allow the user to pick a book and display data on the book's stock quantity. If the quantity will be less than some amount, we will allow the user to restock. First, we need to create in the module a form definition that will hold a form. Let's name it stock check. The root component must allow us to insert multiple components, since we want to have a part with the book selector and another part with the book stock details. We want to have them below each other, so let's insert the vertical layout component. Let's insert the panel into it. The panel component can contain only one component, however, it serves to divide the form into parts with the title. Let's define its title as book select. This will be displayed as the panel's caption, and let's insert a single select list into the panel. We can afford to use this component since there are only a few book entities in the database. I'm using it to keep the form a bit simpler. In real life, you will probably want to use a lazy loading combo box for similar use cases, or possibly a page table with some filtering and columns with checkboxes. Let's define the single select properties. Set the ID to book select. set the binding to a reference to a local variable. Let's name it selected book. Let's create the variable. Since we will be selecting books, the variable will be of type book. Let's now define the options that should be available in the selector. We want to return one option for every book. Let's call collect on the result set of get all books and run a closure that wraps every book in an option. So the input is the book, B book, and it will create a new option with a value property set to be and label set to be title. Let's validate, confirm, and let's save. Note that we are using a query here to acquire the books. The query will be called whenever the component is refreshed. So again, in real life, it would be a better idea to store the value possibly in a variable to prevent frequent database accesses. Another property we want to set is the immediate property. The property applies only to value change events produced by the component. These are events that are produced when the user changes a value, be it a select or an input. So not when they click a button, not when they upload a file, but when they provide or modify a value. In the terms of the system, this happens when the binding of component requests a change. Let's get back to immediate mode. If you set it to true, the events are triggered immediately when the component loses focus. If the property is set to false, the value change events wait until another event type is triggered, and the events are fired only then along with the event of another type. This allows you to create UIs where the user changes multiple values, let's say provides their name, their email address, then their mailing address, then their phone number, and only when they press a button the change events are fired and changes are validated. If immediate was set to false, every single input would be validated immediately when the component would lose focus. So the form might validate input prematurely. However, this is not our case. We want the value change event to be fired immediately, not to wait for us to do something else. So let's set it to true. After we have selected a book, we want to display its stock balance along with other details. If no book is selected, no such data should be displayed. To apply this condition, let's insert into the form a conditional component. We will set the show property to check the value of the selected book variable. So if the variable is null, it will return false, otherwise it will return true. Let's define the component ID as book details. So we can refresh it on book select. And now we insert into the conditional what we want to display if the condition is true. So let's insert another panel, into it a vertical layout, since we want it to hold more than just one component. And into the vertical layout, let's insert two output texts. The first output text will show the concatenation of the literal book and selected book title. The second output text will show the concatenation of the literal in stock and selected book in stock property and the literal pieces. Now we can use the feature called form preview to test our form. When you run a form preview, the server runs a persisted instance of the model that contains the form. So the model's global variables are initialized, the form parameters are initialized, and the form screen context is created. Right-click the form, go to Run As, and click Form Preview. When we now select the book, we see that the book details are not displayed. This happens because the conditional component is not refreshed when we select the book. So let's go back to PDS and fix this. let's define a listener on the selector that will refresh the book details conditional. We want to define a value change listener since we are listening for a value change event, in our case the book selection. And we want to refresh the book details component when the listener catches a value change event. Let's run the form preview again. And we see that the conditional is now displayed as expected. Let's get back to PDS since we still want to tweak the form so that when we select a book and the book stock quantity is less than 10, the user will be allowed to restock. Let's insert a restock button into the book details panel to avoid the case when no book is selected. Its ID will be restock button and its label restock. It should be disabled if there are more than 10 pieces of the selected book in stock. So let's set it to selected book in stock more than 10. We have to make sure the button is recalculated whenever another book is selected. So let's add the button refresh to our selector value change listener. Let's insert another conditional below the restock button. Let's name it restock conditional. Its show property will be resolved as the value of a local variable. Let's say show restock panel. Let's create this Boolean variable. So local variable in the form. Set its initial value to false, so it is not displayed first. Let's insert an input text box where the user will provide the required quantity. The label will be order quantity. The quantity will be stored in the order quantity variable. This will be another form variable of type integer. Let's create the variable. We want the condition to be displayed when the restock button is clicked. So let's define another action event listener, this time on the restock button. On click, we want to refresh the restock conditional content displayed after the click on the restock button. If we ran the form now, we still would not have the restock text box displayed after clicking the restock button. This is because the value of the Boolean variable would be still false. So as a handle in the listener, we will assign the show restock panel variable the value true. And let's run the form preview again. Pick a book, we can restock, define the restock quantity. And let's say I change my mind and I want to check another book. If I select another book now, the restock quantity remains visible and the defined value is retained. Let's solve this by resetting the show restock panel and order quantity variable when another book is selected. So let's open the value change listener on the selector. And in its handle expression, define the values of the reset variables. So show restock panel will become false and order quantity will become 0. Also, let's add a submit button. When we click the button, we want the to-do or document to be submitted. So let's define an action listener. And it will do the submit action. On submit, the data from the form are persisted if in the to-do finishes and the process continues its execution. You could continue by defining, for example, a handle expression on the action event listener so that another process will be triggered that will take care of the restocking on click. Let's preview the final form. Let's pick a book. Click the restock, find its restock quantity. Let's change the selected book. Everything seems to work just fine. This was a tutorial on listeners and event handling in LSPS form. Thank you very much for watching.